Greta Gerwig is going to mess up Narnia. This is the call of many people. Some I know personally, some who frequent online forums, and more than a few podcasters and YouTubers have their thoughts. Many hopeful and some not so hopeful. Gerwig is the creative mind behind movies like Lady Bird, Little Women, and Barbie, and has been tasked by Netflix at directing their adaptation of Narnia. As someone who has a deep passion for all things C.S. Lewis, I figured I'd give my 2 cents, even though I'm a little late to the scene. Though I do have mixed feelings, I am more than a little concerned about the many ways that Gerwig and Netflix may thoroughly mess up Narnia. Alright, so I guess there it is. Greta Gerwig is going to direct Narnia, and or at least the first few installments, I think, is what has been said. Netflix, they bought the rights, I think it was back in 2018, to make adaptations of the Chronicles of Narnia, and it seemed like they sat on them for quite some time. I was a little bit more excited back then than I am now, given the way that I feel like our entertainment over the last few years has slowly, maybe more quickly, really deteriorated. And so, yeah, I'm still definitely intrigued. I mean, I guess the short version, but we'll see what happens. A few of my concerns and just things that I want to talk about. I do think Gerwig is an interesting choice for directing. And interesting, I mean, kind of in all of the ways that word can be used. Interesting good, interesting bad. Again, it can go in many directions. I've only seen 2 of her big 3 movies, Barbie and Little Women. I haven't seen Lady Bird, and my understanding is that has slightly more religious, like directly religious things going on, given that the main character, I think, is kind of dealing with her religious upbringing, and seems to be Gerwig's way of dealing with her own religious upbringing. I believe she went to Catholic school. I don't know if she was raised Catholic in the family necessarily. And I've also heard that she's had multiple years of theological education in addition to that. I don't know if that's true. That could just be a rumor. And so I do think that she has some of the chops to do this and do this well potentially. But if she uses this, excuse me, as an outlet to deal with her religious upbringing in a way that is inauthentic to what Lewis is doing with his stories, then I think things could skew pretty wrong pretty quick. And so I guess that's really my biggest concern with her as the pick. Granted, I don't think any of the directors of the last adaptations that we got were particularly religious, and at least The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was excellent. Prince Caspian definitely had its faults, but I thought it was decent. Voyage of the Dawn Treader was just bad, but anyway, all of that to say, the religious aspect doesn't necessarily need to be there, at least ingrained in the person that's directing and leading this. As long as they can get out of the way and let Lewis through, I think, is the biggest deal. A few things that I've heard her say in press talking about this and other things that I have cause for concern. I think it was an interview that she had with the BBC. She talked about how she made comments about being concerned that or trying to be intentional about making sure that this very British story that's being handled by an American still has its Britishness represented. I think that's a fair concern. I mean, Lewis was a very British man. Particularly The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe happens at a very punctuated time. It would be a way to put it in Britain's history, right, during World War II. The children are sent away in that story to get away from the bombings that are happening. And so I definitely want to see the Britishness of Lewis come through. But again, as a Christian myself, and as someone who's very passionate about Lewis and the things that Lewis stood for, I want to see Lewis shine through, not just in his Britishness, but in his Christianness, and in his particular brand of Christianness, because he does have a particular feel to him. Not all Christians could have written the Narnia stories. Particular kind, and the particular kind that Lewis is. And so, yeah, I understand the context of that comment was when she was talking, I believe, with the BBC, and so she's wanting to say, hey, classic British story, I want to do it justice in its Britishness. But again, given her past in dealing with religious themes, even in Barbie, I don't want the Britishness to outshine the Christianness or the Lewisness, and so I'm a little worried about that. Another thing that I'm a little worried about, after this announcement, I went and watched two of her three biggest movies. I haven't had the time to watch the third, Lady Bird, but I watched Little Women and Barbie, and one of the things that stood out to me in both was the way that, now Barbie, this makes a little bit more sense for, because it was a movie made now for now. It's definitely a movie that is dealing with contemporary questions and wrestling with the spirit of the age. Little Women, interestingly enough, also does that a little bit in ways that, at least my wife, who's read the book, I admittedly haven't, tells me that, I mean, and of course the book wasn't written now, and so it's not going to wrestle with contemporary questions, but the book doesn't do that, and the movie brings some of these things out, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it also brought some of these things out in a way that I feel was inauthentic to some of the characters, especially as I've been informed they are in the book themselves. And so one of the sisters in the cast of Little Women has this raging feminist moment, and it's not that is a bad thing necessarily. In fact, there is a character in the movie that would fit really well for, and that does happen actually in a sense with that character. Her whole story arc is kind of framed around questions of feminism, and wrestling with them really deeply. And I think the movie really does wrestle with the gender dynamics and women being able to support themselves and all of the things that kind of brought the feminist movement to the fore. I think it does wrestle with those incredibly well. One of the ways in which I think it falters is it puts contemporary statements and political agendas in the mouth of a character who, by all rights in character development, shouldn't be saying that. This one particular sister is kind of head over heels for boys in general, and one boy in particular, and she, towards the end of her character arc, she rants towards this boy in a way that doesn't represent that aspect of her character. She gives the feminist talk that I think was actually a pretty fair point to make. I don't disagree with the talk necessarily. I disagree with it being put in her mouth because she's not the kind of character in that story who would do that. And apparently was not the kind of character in the books either. And so that change represents part of the spirit of the age that is somewhat different from Lewis's thought, was different from the thought of the author who wrote Little Women, at least partially. and at least wasn't handled in that way by the author who wrote Little Women. And so I have a little bit of concern about that. I don't want... There are many ways in which we may or may not be able to critique Lewis based on our standards today, in ways that he does meet them or does not. And those are fair concerns. And the ways that he portrays characters in his books reflect his own thoughts. Yet, if you're going to make his story, I don't feel like it's appropriate to stray too far from the things that he was doing. Because the minute you change one thing, other things that are downstream of that become affected in ways that you might not be calculating for. It's a complicated way of saying I'm concerned that she will not just let her religious wrestlings, but her political agendas be infused into the story in a way that I don't think reflects Lewis's thought processes and the way Lewis is building things in his stories and in his worlds. The other thing that concerned me, I guess I'll switch from Little Women to Barbie. Barbie was kind of preachy at times. It felt a little on the nose. Barbie was a weird experience because sometimes it felt really on the nose, and then sometimes it felt a lot more subtle. And I think people who think that Barbie is a feminist anthem may be missing the point of Barbie a little bit. I don't think it was saying everything that the feminists wanted it to, or that the red pill bros who really attached themselves to Ken wanted it to either. It was funny because it was kind of like someone threw a Barbie grenade into our current cultural matrix and everyone took away from it what they wanted to. And I don't really have any solid takes, but there were times in which I felt like Barbie was a little bit more on the nose than I would hope an adaptation of Narnia would be. Lewis is I've just been reading The Medieval Mind by The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, by a scholar by the last name of Baxter. And in it, he argues that one of Lewis's core convictions, and I think this is totally true, I mean, if you read anything like Meditation in a Tool Shed or Transposition or Myth Became Fact, one of the biggest missions of Lewis was to use literature not to just transform our thoughts, but to transform our being, the way we are in the world, the way we see the world. And he did that through stories because we interact with stories in a different way. And so I don't want to see Narnia become preachy, because there are times in which people feel like it's preachy, but I don't think it's not preachy in the same way that Barbie was when it was preachy. And so I'm hoping that the subtlety, the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis, in a way, to borrow that title, gets carried through. That's genuinely what I'm hoping for. I'm also a little worried that, and this is just pretty frequent now with new Star Wars things coming out, or people messing with Lord of the Rings, with Rings of Power. I don't want Narnia's lore to get messed with. There's so much that Lewis says, and then there's so much that Lewis doesn't say. And so I'm hoping that if Greta Gerwig is going to play with the lore, she's going to play in the negative space. She's going to build things out and be more expansive. Don't change things that have already been stated, but take the world that Lewis has given us and build it out, incarnate it, flesh it out in new and interesting ways. I do think that's appropriate and necessary. I don't necessarily want you to do a shot-for-shot remake of the last films or the books. It's okay to put your own artistic spin on it, but I want the spirit of Lewis and the lore that he established to be the starting point on which you build. And right now it's really popular to change things to fit fleeting ideologies of our current moment. And so that's the last thing I want. One last parting thought. I've heard, I don't know if it's rumor or if it's confirmed, that Douglas Gresham is going to be involved in the production. I hope that's true. We'll see. But if he can give guidance, being who he is and how he's related to Lewis, I think that could be really helpful. But I also know, or I shouldn't say no, I've heard that he did help with some of the previous movies as well. And that would make him at least partially responsible for some of the ways they've gone wrong, especially with Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And so I also don't think that even he has fully understood certain aspects of Lewis. And so I guess I hope they're paying attention to people who are passionate and care and what they care about. I hope they're not out to make a quick buck with some fancy special effects, but a good story that we can be transformed by, because that is why Lewis wrote the stories. Anyway, those are some quick thoughts.